hints of other nostalgia that we're back in this place, completely different context. But what we want to talk about today, we call it, we title it In Between. In between. Between them. It's the fascination of having a wife, maybe the term a wife partner. And she will correct me throughout the whole lecture, so get used to it. So the title of this talk, Between Them, relates back to our ideas of the third space, or architecturally perceived as threshold, space, time, and practice. Let me start with a quote by literary critic Terence Holmes. The true nature of things may be said to lie not in things themselves, but in the relationship which we construct and then perceive. This is our office. So this is our own office in Shanghai. And we have not an office in London anymore, but satellite offices in Paris and Cyprus. So the notion of traversing between space and time and practice has long been embedded in Neri&Hu's architectural practice. Thresholds are important to us because we constantly traverse between locations, not just in personal practice, but early on my partner and I used to travel to Shanghai from the US for work on various different projects, different practices. Before starting our practice, we were both graves. But after moving and establishing our practice in Shanghai about 20 years ago, we now, in kind of a funny way, reverse that direction and travel to different parts of Asia, to Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and now the US. This is a current exhibition in the Studio of Work in the 80s Gallery in Berlin. It shows 70 years of work in progress. And we say work in progress because none of our work is really final. It's constantly in the cusp of that in between that we were talking about. So our travel takes us to places of different cultures, and we realize that we are often in between them. Being Chinese born in different parts of Asia, my partner and I were educated in the US during our formative years. About 20 years ago, we made a conscious effort to return to Rossana's father's homeland, hometown, Shanghai. This hybrid identity for Rossana, who was Chinese born in Taiwan, with a lot of Japanese influence. Her grandparents were literally raised in Japan. She was raised in Chicago and San Francisco. For me, I'm a Chinese diaspora, born in the Philippines with a lot of Spanish. So my aunt moves a little bit more, why is the Chinese so weird? Raised in San Francisco and GH. So traversing between these identities makes us keenly aware of architecture's implicit capacity to define, construct, and interrogate culture. So today we will examine a series of contemporary issues in various cultural contexts, aiming to shed light on how we traverse that in between, that threshold. This particular image is fresh off the press. It's an extension to a mural museum and the Westin Hotel, which we actually did about 15 years ago. And the client came and wanted an extension on the museum component of it. In the ancient city of Xi'an, famously known for terracotta gardens, for those of you that do not know China very well. This shows that our work not only crosses between locations and cultures, but also between technologies, dealing with the idea of hotel and museums. So the lecture will examine a series of contemporary issues in various global contexts and aims to shed light on how our practice, this particular firm, grounds its work. At the same time, maintaining an intellectual inquiry into adaptive reuse and the role of history, reimagining spatial legibility associated with voyeurism tectonics in the use of crochet, a search for connection back to the net. So some of these are the smaller scale house projects, Shanghai, and the other one recently published work in Singapore. And of course, the role of collective memory, reflective nostalgia, ruins, fragments, and the idea of ruinophilia, which we will elaborate more later. So this is the Design Republic store in Shanghai. Many of you that are probably familiar, this was in the cover of Architectural Record about 8 years ago when it opened. The project above is an example of projects that occupies cultural and typological thresholds where we search for a connection back to the vernacular, especially in adaptive reuse programs like this particular Beijing project, a pastry factory and retail gallery. We often cross divides between time, between the past, present, and future. When we work on a site that we do not want to completely demolish, but can no longer restore it back to how it used to be, what is the criteria that we deal with, and how do we pedagogically take a particular position? We use the word threshold because we find that we are always working with the ideas of the in-between. For instance, this particular small restaurant renovation in Paris, it's a small Italian restaurant owned by a Parisian and helmed by a famous Japanese chef. Talked about being confused, talked about dealing with all the in-betweens and all the cultural ramification that comes with it. It was quite interesting, small, but an exploration that we're constantly having to deal with. Threshold also deals with different variations, often crossing divides that tradition, institutions, society, or even what our profession has predetermined. And oftentimes, it is those traditions that we're always questioning and trying to break. The obvious divide, you can say, are past, future, east, west, global, local, urban, rural, interior, exterior. But other more nuanced divide, we feel, have over the years become themes that helps us analyze our own projects. And in fact, today, we will be organizing our talk using those themes to describe many of our projects. This is a project in Shanghai, the Shanghai Theater that we did about 7 years ago. We showcase some of the work here because we can only show, due to time, we're only showing 6 projects today. As a practice, this place we call home now, Shanghai or China, sets the stage for a design exploration. This is also the title of our second monograph, which is shown here, Threshold, Space, Time, and Practice. Today we will be speaking on 6 projects. They all occupy within these thresholds that we were talking about, threshold between the past and the future, the in-between of old and new, each relating to different readings of site, cultural, program, and history.
So before moving to showing our projects, let me set the context of where we work and also explain a few key concepts for you to understand why we're showing the work. Many of our work respond to the ever-pressing problem in China related to the broader subject of sustainability and restoration, or often termed as adaptive reuse. Since 1990, 1 out of 6 families in China have been evicted and relocated. Our office was such a victim 4 years ago, the one that you just saw that Lyndon was showing. The intense development over the last 20 years has forced a city like Shanghai to confront with the aftermath of demolition, the erasure of tradition and memory. This is the rough time period that we have been living and working in Shanghai. And images like this, you might think, oh, staged, or it's for a movie set. But believe it or not, if you've worked or if you've lived in Shanghai like us over the past 20 years, you really do see this. This is just a reality of the city. So while a city like Shanghai must develop very rapidly, early on, we were hoping to find an alternative modes of design to be building in the city. So here we enter into a related but more complex issue of architecture as a means of cultural production and identity. On the left side is Michael Wolff's photography that represents this anonymous urbanization. It could be anywhere. You have no idea where that city is, really. On the right is a traditional Shanghai li long, which is a Chinese word for lanes. They are filled with unique characters that are rich in texture and flavor. And when you see this image, I think most people immediately think it's got to be Shanghai. So this dichotomy of modernity and tradition seems to be contrasting opposites. But we hope for this coexisting balance between the two extremes. Like this bronze lion from Jia Zhanghe's film in 2010 entitled, I Wish I Knew, architects like us wish we know the answers. But like the film's magnificent scenery, when faced with loss and destruction, we often retreat back to nostalgia. Nostos in Greek means homecoming, and algos means pain or ache. Nostalgia, therefore, can be understood as a longing for home, to the point of deep pain. Architecturally, it is like our desire to preserve a historic building or city, to be frozen in time. We just came back from the Venice Biennale, and in Venice, it's almost like everything is frozen in time, but also like the Acropolis or the Xi'an terracotta warriors. Svetlana Bohm, professor at Harvard who passed away a few years ago, she wrote extensively about this in her book, The Future of Nostalgia. And she called this type of attitude for preservation restorative nostalgia, a literal reconstruction of the lost home. But there's another way to think about nostalgia, and that is what she termed reflective nostalgia, which is more a longing for home, longing for the past, even if you may never arrive home. So you may not be restoring it back to how it used to be, but in the process, something innovative and creative happens. And speaking of the past, we find that reflective nostalgia has this uncanny similarity to the Eastern idea of ruins, quite different from what we have all probably learned in our history classes in the West. The English word for ruin originated in the idea of falling, like fallen stones, like what's on the left side here, the Roman ruins of the Forum. This material of stones, literally falling stones, is what makes ruins ruins, right? And it creates this romantic notion of ruins as a desirable visual aesthetic. But if we turn to the right image, it's an ink drawing by Shi Tao, and this is from his Yellow Mountain series. That material remnant is missing in this painting about ruins. There's no building or no stones present anywhere. In fact, the earliest Chinese character for ruin is simply a mound of rubble. In Chinese, it's called qiu, like on the right. It's an example of a qiu, the remains of a palace in Shanxi province from the 3rd century BC. Shown here next to the qiu is Tintern Abbey. I think we all know it very well, considered a perfect ruin by Thomas Whately in 1772, where the original structure is visible and the erosion is identifiable and deemed as romantic, and also a perfect romanticism. So what does this mean? It means that the concept of ruin in China is an internalized concept and not the romantic aesthetic we have learned in our history. Take Shi Tao's Qingliang Tai, which is Qingliang Terrace, done in 1700. He shows no trace of damaged architecture, even if the inscription is about broken roofs and ruined entrenchment. This idea of absence, void, internalization will be important to understand the work we will be showing today. So coming to projects, the very first project is one of our first architectural works, and it's on the south bund, which is not the glorious bund that you see on the right side, but it looked like this. It was once a Japanese police building, initially slated for demolition, as the client wanted a new and polished building for a new boutique hotel. During the first site visit, Lyndon and I went, we walked around, and we were just really taken by this visual cues that prompted us to try a different kind of preservation. At this time, the preservation culture in Shanghai was very much in the restorative nostalgia vein. You either restore things back to exactly how it used to be, or you take it down and rebuild something totally new. We started sketching and looked at different possibilities of how to work with this urban remnant, and then managed to convince the client that this was the cheaper alternative, although our real motivation was to keep parts of this urban memory that no one really wanted to save. The architectural concept behind our renovation rested on a clear contrast between what is old and new. The main entrance here takes you into an interior lobby, which is expressed through a blurring of the interior and exterior, as well as between public and private realms, creating something that is a bit disorienting, but we hoped also refreshing. These visual connections of unexpected spaces, they not only bring on an element of surprise, but also force the guests to confront a uniquely Shanghai urban condition, where visual corridors and adjacencies in tight nongtangs define the daily experience of locals who live there. And Lyndon and I also live in one of those conditions. From the street level restaurant, you can see through towards the open courtyard. And if you stand between the tables, you can look up through the ceiling slit. And this is that slit. And this would be in between two bedrooms. And so it would be between these two bedrooms. And when you look down from the second floor, you can see down to that dining room that you just saw. So there are these really strange but interesting sectional qualities all throughout the project. And part of the existing roof deck were reused to be window panels that are shown here. Interesting dialogue between the present and the past are throughout the building. The section here explains this unique moment of discovery that you can easily get lost. And I think, when we're traveling, getting lost seems to be sometimes the most fun and memorable. Many of the existing stairways were kept with their patinas intact, and some staircases lead to nowhere. They stop midair. This was the most memorable from our first site visit, and we thought we wanted to kind of retain those moments, let all the guests to experience that strange but refreshing journey. Now we will be playing a video. So this project recomposed memories of a city that would have otherwise been demolished. And the most meaningful part of working on this project is how it really changed the perception of preservation, urban reuse, and reconstruction in a city like Shanghai. People started to rethink about the meaning of urban remnants and appreciate it more than just the restored historic buildings in the vein of restorative nostalgia that I just talked about, and then took on a new interest in these kind of projects. Maybe they're less obvious, but equally relevant and significant kind of leftovers from the past. And it was a way for us to challenge and ask the question, under whose authority should buildings be restored, preserved, or demolished? And could small firms like ourselves not so much save, but to breathe new life into something that would have been demolished?
So the ruin in this case operates as the muse, whose power is to elicit visceral experiences, to create a connection to the past. However, the basis for adaptive reuse and even some of the seemingly ground-up projects, which I'm going to show next, more often than not are not always non-romantic relics from the past. The muse in question does not always follow a conventional set of aesthetic nor value assignation.
So there's this constant dialogue between the building and the city, and here you can see that often in front of the building you'll see the ships running alongside the Pudong River. And the rusticated metal from these ships that pass by every hour is echoed on the material that we use for the addition on the top of the existing concrete. And we also, for this project, wanted to explore the idea of traveler versus the tourist, where the spatial experience of the city is subtly embedded in the way that one journeys through the building. It's not about checking off the list of destinations you go to when you visit a city or seeking for that Instagrammable moment, but it's always the unplanned or the surprises, unexpected surprises that you encounter when you get lost in the city that's the most interesting. And like Kafka's quote, if you find nothing there, don't worry, just leap up another flight of stairs, which is painted on one of the walls alongside the stairway.
So the next project is a sanctuary, a chapel in a city about an hour and a half away from Shanghai called Suzhou. So in the general vicinity of Jiangnan, literally meaning south of the Yangtze River. It is situated next to a scenic river, a lake, sorry. What's quite interesting is the developer has taken over, sorry, this aerial view is rather blurry, had taken over a village, and in return of making the village come alive, the government had given them subsequent plots, including some of the reclaimed area for them to build houses. And in this particular project, we were doing some of the smaller houses, and we were also asked to do a chapel, which was a rare opportunity for us at that time to actually design a new building. And it was a chapel, so it was an interesting cultural project. So we started to look at Wu Guangzong's drawing, painting, which is shown on the left, a painterly rendition of this particular kind of vernacular sublime, characteristic of the white walls and gray clay tiles found in this particular area. Naturally, we tried to do something with our own work. Whether it actually worked or not, that's a different story. It's for you to judge. But we tried to use architectural, sort of the architectural palette, and in order to give that patina, Rossana and I start asking ourselves, why don't we use recycled bricks to actually look into this painterly patina that we were very interested in. So the program called for a small chapel, non-denominational, to serve as the main lighthouse for this development. So we employed a simple design language derived from the grays and white of this region by using reclaimed recycled bricks from 5 of the village next to Suzhou. The inner layer, which is a simple concrete box, punctuated on all sides with scattered windows, and the outer layer is a folded and perforated metal skin, a veil, if you will, that alternatively hides and reveals. It's on a sloping site, so what we did was we created this landscape brick base, and with the lantern sitting up above. The walls were made from reclaimed bricks, begin with refined scale, and as you moved along, it starts to perforate and have different patterns, have different heights that interweave to create a choreographed landscape journey from the ground to the chapel, a half floor below, and to the rooftop garden 3 stories above. These are the floor plan. What was interesting about this particular chapel is the fact that it not only sits on the brick base, but the chapel itself and the sanctuary, which was 12-meter high, had a prominent staircase, which led you from the ground floor to the roof garden. And this particular stairway, we spent a lot of time articulating, that leads you to a journey up above. It was also a way to ensure that people who are not so familiar or not so comfortable with the idea of a chapel or a sanctuary would find this sense of respite within this journey without necessarily entering the chapel. So the rich sensorial experience, the play of light and shadow, the sound from the chapel is heard, but you are hidden from the crowd. If the chapel is to congregate, here in this particular space is for isolated contemplation. Unfortunately, many of these images are not very clear. It seems like it's just all concrete, but we've actually managed to use beautiful terrazzo and bronze made in this particular region. The mezzanine level hovers overhead to accommodate extra guests and includes a catwalk encircling the space, allowing 360 degrees of viewing angles. The wood louvered cage that wraps around the whole second floor seems to float, at least tectonically. And also from the back of the mezzanine, you can also go out to this particular path that is part of the base that's completely carved. And within this guide, you'll go down to the lake below. Tectonically, the white volume is specially treated with 2 layers of exterior. So as a practice, about 10 years ago, we started to use videos as a way to document our work. We believe strongly that architecture should be experienced firsthand and not just with beautiful photographs, beautiful images, and drawings. Given that it is difficult for people to visit our projects, we made a conscious effort to document the work, our work, to give it that spatial experience that is important to us. Not perfect, not ideal. Obviously, the best would be for you to experience the space. But especially during COVID, many of our projects were completed, and we spent a lot of time documenting them through video. This was our first ground-up project, and a lot of people often question why we actually use old materials, but that was very important for us. In many ways, this was one of the first rural projects that we took on, and we realized and we decided that perhaps recycling is not just about recycling old buildings, but recycling is also about using found objects around the area. So it's actually very interesting to be able to see many neighboring people from the villages that would come to this chapel, and oftentimes they would look at the brick and they would recognize that it is from their village. So this particular chapel became technically a lighthouse for the development, but literally became that beacon that kind of united all the surrounding villages. And obviously this place is rented out over the weekend for many different events. Initially it started as a commercial venture, but it became more a communal space as it progressed through time.
So this next project takes us to yet another city. So we started in Shanghai. Suzhou, it's about an hour and a half from Shanghai driving. And now we're going down south to a place called Fuzhou. And this image is really important because our project drew inspiration from this work of photography from 1871 of a dilapidated temple resting on a floating rock. It appeared in photographer Thomason's legendary journey when he was traveling in the Min River area. And he documented this in a very famous album that he produced after that area. The client's brief to us was to design a tea house, and Fuzhou is a city that is known for making really good tea. But also, this tea house was to be used as an enclosure for an old wooden structure from the Qing dynasty. So this is that structure. The structure was relocated from Anhui, so it's not even kind of authentic from, you know, the area where the project is. So it's a relocated relic from Anhui that is going to be enshrined in a new project. And to this image kind of deconstructed the different parts for clarity. We start with the solid base down below. The spaces inside are carved out of that solid. And then the wooden structure sits on top, being contained like an artifact under the red copper roof. And you can see where that relic is. It's on the right side. We first envisioned the project as a house atop a rock, kind of like that Jingshan temple photography. And the rammed concrete base takes on the reading of that solid rock. And you can see from the slit under the copper roof, the wooden house from the Qing dynasty. It's like a hint of what is inside for the pedestrians who are walking along the sidewalk. Its base material, this rammed concrete, is a mixture of rammed earth and concrete, a modern homage to the traditional earthen dwellings of the region, emphasizing a raw monumentality. You enter here on the first floor side corridor, and this is the main tea room. The basement level includes a secondary lobby and a sunken courtyard and tasting rooms. We were happy to see this image being on the cover of the last issue of Domus. When guest editor John Novell, he asked the timely question, are we entitled to modify the past? In that issue, Novell, he explored many of the questions that we asked throughout today's talk. How do we stitch history with the present and bring it towards the future? This project also asks a question of what architectural relic means today. Other than on display in a museum, could they coexist with contemporary structure to create a hybrid typology? So let's play the video. And the project is named Relic Shelter since it literally internalizes and contains a piece of distinct artifact. And the idea of containment is clearly defined here. You can see it through the entry. You can also see it on the street when you walk by. But more than something on display, it is also integrated as part of the new building. You see the wooden columns of the relic defining the formal space of the large tea hall. And here down below, on the level below, the level of the rammed earth, is a large circular reception for guests to relax. And outside the elements can be seen, like the rain can be seen through the skylight and slivers of window. From the grand hall, oh, this is still the basement. From this grand hall for tea service, one can walk up these stairs up to the mezzanine level, where the wooden relic is at eye level on the right side. The new roof in copper echoes the roof line of the enclosed wooden relic. There's a sunken courtyard that contains a pool that filters light below through this thin film of water. This project juxtaposes a preserved and restorative piece of history with a new structure and formally reflects the ruin of the Jingshan Temple, a collective memory of Fuzhou City's past.
The next project is called The Void, Aranya Art Center. It's about 3 hours east of Beijing, in a city called Qinhuangdao, in a seaside resort community. The developer was a visionary. He's been developing many cities outside of major metropolitan cities in China, and he argues that if you bring culture into massive development, that people will actually take the time and effort during the weekend and move away from major cities. So when this developer approached us, we were all very excited. And many of you, if you're familiar with this particular developer, he had employed many famous Chinese designer architects to build on the seaside property. So without even questioning or asking where this particular site is, I just assumed that our site would be along many of our colleagues, be it vector or open architecture or Zhangke. We were very wrong. So we were given this site very far away from the beautiful seaside resort. In fact, he told me on the phone that this is a very European-like village. Well, that European village is a fake Mediterranean village. And you can imagine how disappointed we were. But given the fact that he was a visionary, and he convinced us, he says, Lyndon, why don't you do a rock, a landscape rock within that will bring culture into this building. So we used the idea of a primitive geometry, which is prevalent in a lot of our work, as a means to give form to this abstract concept of presence and absence. So in this particular case, the building's fortress-like exterior conceals a central void space. The building takes on a simple geometric massing that maximizes the building footprint to impart a decidedly heavy elemental presence. Serving as the heart of the building, the circular pathway leads you to all the different spaces, exhibition spaces around it. We also took and seized the opportunity to question the notion of space for art versus communal space. We questioned the idea of what this urban artifact should be in a fake Mediterranean community. We decided to celebrate the landscape. We said if we don't have that landscape to ourselves, we will create our own landscape by having this hole that looks up to the sky and fill the auditorium below with water. Now, the client did not know that. The client thought there was always a roof. And so we made in our drawing, he couldn't really read drawings. So you can imagine these were my sketches. And every time he says, what is that hole there? I said, well, there's going to be a glass. It was only later, after his budget was completely spent, that he realized there was absolutely no money for the roof. But the scheme maximizes its outer footprint and carves out a pure canonical geometry at the center with a stepping amphitheater at the base. And this particular base is filled with water when there is no program. We also made the facade out of various textured concrete and terrazzo, some with and some without aggregate. The facade and the materiality of the building is heavy in nature. He keeps calling this place, he wanted it to be a rock, a foundation. So it was a perfect way of abstracting this particular typology. Smooth surfaces reflect the changing skies, which you will see on the interior, while the molded modular units pick up on the play of shadows throughout the day. We added bronze element to act as accents on the heavy facade to catch light and draw attention to the entry of each gallery. So you see this at night. This is the entry. This is the floor plan with a thick mass of the building and a series of interlocking spaces that allows you to meander around this circular atrium space. This spiral path leads you through all the spaces, urging you onward by the desire to see more. And you see sort of this carved, this opening that opens up to the sky, The gallery spaces also allows you to enjoy the art at moments that also takes your view towards up award the sky and looking down upon this open auditorium that is extremely popular now in this particular town and this development. Obviously, beyond the functional aspect of art viewing, we see this space as the core of the project, this absence, if you will, which, if not occupied, becomes the center pool area, this meditative space, and gathers the community for concert, dramas, and other functions of gathering. So the central void space can be reconfigured and used in many ways. A water feature when filled with water, but also a functional performance and gathering space when the water is drained. Borrowing from Martin Heidegger's seminal text, Building, Dwelling, Thinking, the boundary is not a point of termination, but a point where presencing begins. Rooted in the notion of contrast, many of our projects use opposition to heighten and reveal the dialectics of inside, outside, and the part to the whole. The notion of absence or void for us can be understood in relation to the Chinese concept that Rossana described of rhinophilia. Many of the works are seen only as the essence of that building and the foundation as traces of their original grandeur. Evident in its etymology, the word for ruin, which evolved from the word shou to xu, indicates that over time, the concept of the architectural ruin was increasingly freed from the external visual signs, relying on allusion rather than direct literal representation.
This next project brings us to yet another city in Yangzhou, and it's really funny because I think this is the first time I'm speaking with an American audience after COVID. So when I'm speaking to an audience in Europe or other parts of Asia, I would tell them that Yangzhou is very well known in America because in American Chinese restaurants, you get this Yangzhou fried rice. But I guess you guys all know that. So this is where Yangzhou fried rice is from, and it's the Yangzhou retreat. It's a wellness retreat for 20-room. Wellness retreat. So the site looked like this before we started. It's been dilapidated for a very long time. It's about 3 hours train ride from Shanghai, and it's a scenic destination next to the slender West Lake. Here the site or the ground is the ruin rather than the relic that we saw a while ago or the urban warehouse. So to work with the ruin, we used a different strategy of dispersion, which I will talk about later. And the vernacular condition in this ancient city was really important for us. We walked around the city, we visited a nearby relic. It's an important garden called Geyuan, and we learned from it different aspects of Chinese garden design, and also we found this interesting plaque that shows this 9-grid housing unit with 2 really prominent lanes in the center, and they run north and south, and they're important because they're the fire lanes that prevent the spread of fire. But they also take on a very auspicious nature because only rich people had these lanes. And their names are called coffin lanes, but in Chinese it's 棺材巷, meaning, rising in ranks and, becoming, gathering wealth. And also they are very narrow, so the more you walk into it, it narrows, so it means keeping your wealth, so it doesn't go away. So with all these kind of experience that we had, we thought it would be interesting to use those lanes as a guiding kind of factor to organize the different programs with those lanes. And here we will start the video, and I will explain the project with the video, given we're short of time. We start with this aerial view where you see a clear orthogonal orientation, right? So this gridded walkway is what came out of those fire lanes. They're inspired by those fire lanes, and they organize the different zones, they guide the circulation, and also define and wrap the buildings within. And you see those adjacent ponds. I think you can see some of the waterways. And it's right here. They become part of the total landscape. It's like borrowing view from the Chinese garden design methodology. So even though the site is very small, but you kind of gain the view from around the site. This project almost entirely is composed of reclaimed bricks from nearby villages, a lot like our Suzhou chapel. The aged bricks, they immediately give the project a lived-in look, like it's always been there, and they offer a continuation to the history of the city that Yangzhou is known so well. Although it is expressed in a modern kind of design language, there is a direct connection to the material history of this place by using these bricks. They are laid in different patterns, as you can see here. Some invented by us, some are new patterns, but some are based on what we found in some of the historic walls here. And the bricklayers, the local bricklayers, they actually taught us different ways of laying the bricks from what we are used to. And the bricks are reassembled on site as pathways of connection that you can see here. And this way, the act of destruction of another relic becomes part of a new building and gives newfound relevance. Thresholds are less defined, boundaries are less clear, blurring the lines between old and new. And they also form this kind of new landscape, one that is not so traditional, but composed in a modern rigor that works to reveal the paradox of this artificial organic that is found in the traditional gardens. So these pathways are important, inspired by those fire lanes, but they really lead you everywhere. When you go from your room to breakfast, or you go from your yoga class to meet your friend in the tea house, you always have to return back to those covered walkways. And the design also came from a reworking of those found imprints, because this project we had to work with buildings that have already been on site that were removed. I think this was like a planning rule that we couldn't really build on parts that didn't, land that didn't have a existing foundation. So in a way, it's like working with the ghosts that have been built, but no longer. The buildings have disappeared, so we've kind of built new buildings on those footprints. And so to us, it's kind of like recasting a new vernacular. And the video is taken almost immediately after the construction. So you don't see a lot of greens, but in fact, I think a year or two after we went back, and it's just covered with a lot of trees and a lot of lush greenery. I think he's going to stand up and close the doors. And that ends this film.
So the last project takes a similar approach to using incision and stitching as a formal strategy. but yielding a very different result. So we are in the south of China in Nantou, a place called Sensen. Sensen is known as a city without a history, but there's a vibrant urban village. In this urban village, for the longest time, was what we call the central business district for Sensen at that time. But you can imagine the buildings, the high-rises on that image to the right, many of them commissioned by major developers. So the central business district have moved towards up north. And BRK Ingalls, Rem Koolhaas, KPF, they all have a share on those new developments. Wangke, on the other hand, Wangke, the developer, decided that we cannot just leave this particular urban condition to rot. So they proposed to take over this urban village and ask all the owners of the buildings to rent the space to them for 10 years. They would build this building and rent it, obviously at a higher rate that the current owners are renting it for. And after 10 years, the buildings will be given back to them. So they argue that if they renovate all 300 buildings and maybe pick 15 cultural projects, and of those 15, made conscious effort to have significant architects come and work on them. So architects like Vo Trong from Vietnam, Sejima, Herzog de Moron, MVRDV is doing a co-working. In fact, MVRDV finished the first co-working office space. And a number of other architects, both local and international. But characters like these winding alleys, hidden corners, dead end, narrow gaps between buildings are an inspiration to us. So when we were asked to do this yellow building here, we were actually we were pleasantly happy to intervene on this 8-story tall existing building. And the brief was very simple. Wangke wanted to be a kezan, a guest house for their development. So they just wanted to have 11 rooms, 11-room guest house. So this was the context that we have. Our yellow building, as you can kind of see, pink, it's actually yellow pink. I can't even find it. Where did it go?
Over there.
Yeah, right there, the yellow building. You can. Anyways, the yellow building is here. So this was that existing building that we were given. Quite interestingly enough, we went back to what Svetlana Boym talks about, this idea of ruinophilia, and we start thinking that perhaps the idea of ruins don't necessarily mean it's a sense of collapse, but perhaps a reminder of the past, and perhaps in her logic that there could be a different argument for the ruin, which is not romantic, not baroque, not melancholic, but a form of toleration of disharmony, that the idea of collage, the idea of things that are not completely perfect aesthetically, might be a condition that we can live with as a society. And for us as architects, maybe this toleration of plural modernities could be a potential strategy. Rediscovering off-modern ruins, very easy to just demolish this, but then we decided, what if we just completely patch it and bring a certain life to it by not necessarily destroying it. So we were also reminded of Mata Clark's work, both his canonical intersect in 1975 from the Paris Biennale and the splitting house in Inglewood, New Jersey in 1974. In Paris, he used a radical incision here to the left to critique urban development and the public role of art. He created the void to offer a view of the structure's internal skeletons, thereby in many ways protesting the demolition of the Lihal area. He was aware of sustainability and reuse of the environment before sustainability was fashionable for all of us. In splitting in 1974, he used this house to convert his idea of an internalized state of mind. This resonated with us, given the idea of that the Chinese notion of ruin that we talk about in the beginning of the lecture that Rossana described is something internalized within all of us. So in order to celebrate life in the urban village, you can kind of see in this axon, the existing structure was cut into as a massing strategy, allowing such urban incision to foster a new public realm on the inside the previously private apartment building. This is that building with the veil, two entrances to the guest house. The new entrance was created by extending this particular sidewalk, side street to a new door, like welcoming a new neighbor. Two different entrances, one on the sidewalk, the main entry, the cafe inside. A lot of the furniture and lights were custom made by our practice. That was very important for us as an interdisciplinary practice. So arriving from that alleyway, you do see that cut. The public gesture of opening up the building along the urban axis is then moved upward with an existing stairway that is previously connecting all the 9 tenement floor, now replaced by this new vertical metal stairway. The walls, the elevations cut open and expanded to create this new space, interior space that allows natural light and elements to pass through. This is the interior space. This was also the tub that we did for APIAHiP that's now, which is called Immersion Tub, a smaller version that is very much seen in a lot of Japanese and Chinese contexts. Within the stairway, weather-treated steel doors and walls panels have been inserted within the gridded original concrete structure, hinting at the sheltered private spaces behind. You know, if you've been to Chinese hotels, if you visited a lot of hotels in China, oftentimes along the corridor it's really noisy because people literally open the doors. They take over the idea of what is public and become part of their private lives. So we made their lives easy by having doors to either completely open or half open. And obviously in Sensen, with the weather, you have that gentle breeze. Like the bustling alleys below, the roofscape across Nantou has a life of its own, with makeshift gardens and vegetable farms popping along the jagged skyline. So we made the building retain its original bones and skin, but added another layer of a covering, a veil perhaps. So it takes on a multiple reading of history and the idea of presence. As well as many views, you can look out from the inside. One can see the building appears to be sliced open, but at the same time, when you're within, you actually see snippets of your neighbors and fellow tenants. I'm gonna try to see if this works. Where is it? This is always tricky. This is the last, by the way. Good. Stitch and incision, both surgical in nature, speak to Neri&Hu's archaeological approach of peeling back the layers in the spirit of Gordon Matta Clark's work, whose self-described projects are about making space without building it. Neri&Hu's projects express techniques of erosion and erasure, calibrated to produce new unexpected spatial readings. Remnants are woven together by recomposing an assemblage of found fragments to unify the parts. In Matta Clark's works, the building are the bodies upon which acts of disruption, deconstruction, and deletions are enacted to alter one's spatial orientation. Viewing between the gaps, fissures, and bored apertures, the visitor suddenly gains a newfound awareness of the precarious relationships between rooms, chambers, and urban contexts. In contrast, the act of stitching requires a more labored effort. Stitching demands a certain finesse, where alignments and precision determines its success. Sarah Whiting, Dean of Harvard Graduate School of Design, challenges the term of adaptive reuse in the article she wrote on our projects in Domos magazine, offering another term, seamless synthesis, as her preference to mean something that unlocks intellectual horizons and other worlds with particular magical precision. Quite synthesis that is not meant to mask or distract, but neither is it meant to call attention to itself. Hopefully with this and the other projects we show today, which cross divides between the past and the future, between typologies, between location and cultures, between traditional design practice and alternative programs and functions, we are able to bring forth new meanings to architecture by its ability to construct new relationship, and borrowing from Terence Hawke's words, perceive those that are between them. Perhaps it is in the marginal spaces, the in-between, the third spaces coined by Homi Bhabha, that we find new meaning and purpose in architecture. As the French philosopher once said, we do not aspire to be eternal beings. We only hope things do not lose its meaning and purpose. Thank you. And this is also a very special video.
Thank you so much. Good evening. I'm Diane Taylor, Director of Public Programs here at the museum. I want to thank this special group for being here. We're going to shift gears a little bit to turn our attention to a very unique panel discussion around the topics of collective longing, cultural history, and public memory. We want to ask how architects, historians, and community storytellers can collaborate to illuminate public histories, particularly in places of cultural significance. For this discussion, Neri&Hu will be joined by perspectives from the 1882 Foundation and the Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation, specifically around the work of the Asian American Historic Context Study. So I'd like to introduce our panel moderator, Jenn Low, a collaborator of the 1882 Foundation, landscape architect, educator, and design director at Openbox. And Dr. Michelle Magalong, scholar with the University of Maryland and president of the Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation. We will have a brief presentation by Michelle to kind of give us a little bit of context to the panel discussion.
Hi everyone, good evening. Thank you so much, Diane and Jacqueline and Apostrin for hosting this evening's event. And also Lyndon, Rossana, really inspiring work and really excited to have this conversation with you all tonight. I am Jen, and I've been a collaborator with the 1882 Foundation for a few years now. And I've been really moved by the organization's work through storytelling on making visible the unseen histories of everyday life within Chinese American places nationally and also specifically in Washington, D.C. In Chinatown, where the 1882 Foundation headquarters is. And, you know, it's a neighborhood that's, you know, right next door to this building that tells a story about DC communities in many ways in which is not visible to many residents today. It's also a place of longtime residents, small businesses, spaces of cultural practice, and public life. So it's also, you know, a moment to think about all of the spaces that we exist in this city of communities, culture, public histories, and stories that go often unrecognized in everyday life under sort of this much more larger national identity sometimes. I also want to say thank you to Nia and Gabby too from the 1882 Foundation, who are staff members in our intergenerational space that we take up here in DC. And I'm also really excited for this conversation. And for the National Building Museum to be able to make space to deepen the conversation around casting a different light on preservation that is a lot more complex and nuanced as well. So with that, I'm also really excited to introduce Michelle Magalong, who I've gotten to know through the 1882 Foundation work. She is a friend, a collaborator, and her body of work as an urban planner and historic preservation focuses on the visibility of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and the Pacific Islander experience and histories in place. Michelle's resume is pretty deep. She's assistant professor in historic preservation program at the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. She was also affiliate faculty in Asian American Studies, Urban Studies and Planning, and American Studies. Michelle is also president, as we've heard, of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation, and has a BA in Ethnic Studies and Urban Studies and Planning at the University of California, San Diego, and her MA and PhD in Urban Planning at the University of California, Los Angeles. And her work in preserving historic Asian American neighborhoods and sites is extensive, and that includes historic Filipino Town, Little Tokyo, Thai Town in Los Angeles, Little Manila in Stockton, California. She serves on lots of advisory boards, including the National Park Service, State of California, City of Los Angeles, and their respective theme studies and context statements on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We're really excited that she's decided to live on the East Coast now and be part of the DC and Maryland community. And so with that, I'd like to introduce and have Michelle come up to speak to a little bit of her work situated here locally.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen. Pardon me. I don't want to be hidden by the this podium. But thank you to the National Building Museum for inviting me to speak today. As I was telling some folks earlier, I've done this presentation about 20 times, and I think that it's very relevant as I've spoken to folks like at the Society of Architectural Historians, Asian American Studies, urban planners, historic preservationists, all on the same thing of what is a context statement and why is this important, particularly here for Washington, D.C. So one thing I often ask my audience is if you could raise your hand if you've seen this plaque. And what place do you think of when you see this kind of plaque? You can say it out loud if you'd like. I just want to say here at the National Building Museum, I don't know if you can find this, but it's actually, this was listed, the National Building Museum was listed on the National Register in 1969, and in 1980, it was listed as a National Historic Landmark. As I'd mentioned, it's been mentioned, May is Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Heritage Month and Historic Preservation Month, a very busy month for me. Where have you seen a plaque like this that's associated with Black, Indigenous, or people of color, women, or queer communities? If you could raise your hand, that would be great. And oftentimes, this is the same reaction I usually get, except for preservationists, they all raise their hand. This is something that is close to my heart. Little Tokyo Historic District in near downtown Los Angeles, right across the street from City Hall. This is Little Tokyo, which is a National Historic Landmark. And what's interesting is this is really hard to find. I have my students look for it in a scavenger hunt. It is harder than Pokemon Go. And so they can't find it, and they often don't realize it's next to a historic grapefruit tree that has been standing there since, I think, 1890. And it still produces historic grapefruit. And so it's really interesting. People don't think about, look at the buildings and look at the trees, because those are the places you're going to find our histories. And oftentimes, these are some places, it's kind of hard to see. I lost it in the text. But this is Hanford Alley on the closest top left. Hanford Alley in Hanford, California. Japanese YWCA, a Julia Morgan building on the National Register in San Francisco. To my far right is Little Manila in Stockton, and it's demolition of one of its 3 remaining buildings. The closest to me is the mural from Little Tokyo Historic District. In the middle, you see Angel Island Immigration Station, which is a National Historic Landmark in San Francisco. And then lastly, Soma, Filipinas, or South of Market, Filipinas Cultural District in San Francisco. This is what our places look like. These are places where you can often find plaques. But what's interesting for me as an urban planner is that I'm interested in the people. What are the stories of people? As oftentimes we think of these places as buildings, as structures, but rather, how do these places have meaning to us? Particularly as I first met the keeper of the National Register of Historic Places. She was someone who was just like, why is it difficult for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders to get listed on the National Register? And to me, as a young person, I was kind of miffed at her response or her question at me, and I said, it's a question that you make an assumption that we don't want to be landmarked, right? That's an assumption that we don't know how to do these things, or that it's not important to us. Saving these structures have no meaning to us, that we have no association to these historic places. But what's meaningful to me is places like Stockton, this place that was demolished due to neglect, which was, my colleague, Dylan Delvo from Little Manila Rising, he called me the day of the demolition, and he cried. 20 years after us trying to save Little Manila, he cried and he said, we couldn't save it, we didn't have the money, right? And I said, what's interesting is there's 5 preservationists on your team, but we couldn't save it. And he said it wasn't worth saving. The neglect was so bad that we can't do anything about it. And so it was a moment of reflection for me of like, what are the struggles that we face in saving our places? And oftentimes it's people like the keeper of the National Register at the National Park Service. No bad talk about Dr. Stephanie Toothman at the time. She's a wonderful advocate. But it's a sense of like, these agencies work under places where they don't understand Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander history. And so working with Dr. Toothman, she said, we need to do a better job. We as preservationists need to do a better job of understanding histories of BIPOC communities. And so that what brought forth these context studies. And this is just a brief overview that I often give of a context study gives guidance, right? If something is set to be demolished, the planning agencies or whatever federal agencies has to look and see, is this place significant and to whom? And under what standards? Architecturally is usually the most enforceable standard that we operate under. But what's interesting is for Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and Native Hawaiians, you go to the field, you go to the historic preservation field, and oftentimes with the national conference with over 30,000 attendees, there's only a handful of Asian Americans who attend these conferences. But what's interesting is it's symbolic. On the National Register of Historic Places, which is the federal level designation of landmarks, we are less than 1% on the National Register, but our national population is growing to what's estimated by 2040 to be at least 9 to 10%. So there is disparity in our representation on the National Register, and I mentioned National Historic Landmarks, or we affectionately call it NHLs, not in reference to ice hockey. But the NHLs that are associated with Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is less than 1%, right? So NHLs are supposed to tell America's story of history. And so if Asian Americans are not being told, then where are we included in telling America's history? And so that is something that, has been referenced in my organization, Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation, that our main goal as a nonprofit is to increase the numbers listed on the National Register in terms of its diversity and to be the advocate for BIPOC communities in preservation. And the flip side is also for us to do a better job of teaching the public of what is historic preservation, as it's often not known. It's often something that's seen as you have to go to grad school for. And so, oftentimes we have come to play where we think about, well, how can we do a better job? And so I want to give a nod to the gentleman here. This is Dr. Frank Linoto, who passed away in September, who edited the National Park Service theme study which is 18 chapters telling Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian stories. And when I interviewed him for my dissertation, I said, what is the point of the theme study? And he said, it is to hopefully help drive state and local efforts to get to increase landmarks. And so fortunately, I don't know if you could still get a copy of the book, the printed book, but you could go on the website. If you just Google National Park Service, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders theme study, it'll come up and there's PDF copies. And for me, I was someone of like, how do you study impact? And it was something that I wanted to see. And we saw the state of California followed suit, as well as the city of Los Angeles. The city of Los Angeles did it and broke it down to the historic ethnic neighborhoods of Filipino, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and Thai. And so now all of those are listed on the National Register. So now from going to 1%, we're now at 1.1%. So incremental change does matter. I was invited by folks like Jenn and the 1882 Foundation when they got funding from the National Park Service to do a context study on Asian Americans in Washington, D.C., particularly focused on Chinese American and Korean American history. And so we launched it the month before COVID, Jenn? Right, February 2020. And we were like, we're going to do outreach. Maybe not. And so we had to learn about Zoom. We had to learn about how do we pivot at this time and how do we build a team. And so often, real quick, we had to learn about what's been done. So we had to learn about what did the city of LA do and how do we build that? How do we replicate that and take the best practices and understand the challenges? And this photo to me is like my favorite photo of our team. This is our team. This is so many of us. I've lost count of how many is on our team. Some of them are here. Some of them will be watching this video. But each of them they represent the different disciplines and different institutions that have been collaborative partners, including University of Maryland Historic Preservation Program, American University's Public History Program, the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. These are all amazing folks who have done great work, and they've, contributed in different ways. And one way they've contributed is, we thought about like during the time of COVID, how do you do outreach? We went to Instagram. So each of these were created by each of our team members, and so it's kind of a beautiful quilt, an homage to how do we find Asian American history in Washington, D.C. And this is a quick snippet of a brochure that's created for an event we're having this Saturday in Chinatown of how do you find places of Chinese American and Korean American historical significance. So this is the outside of the trifold, and this is the inside. I know it's very text heavy. You could also QR code it and find the tour. And if you want to learn more, you could actually go to our event that's happening, the QR code for our Eventbrite. It's this Saturday in Chinatown, where you'll hear from different community members as well as our team members who are trying to build out Asian American history in Washington, D.C. And this is just another quick plug of our sponsors. And so, yeah, just wanted to give a little bit of context of our study. Thank you.